Thank you. Okay, let me move to the legal points. Next presentation, the speaker is Carmen Blum, the legal officer of the FAO. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Carmen Blum, Caro is attorney and law major, and she is going to talk by Zoom connection, I believe. So please join me. Welcome to Carmen Blum for her presentation. Okay. Carmen Blum, all yours.
Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Thank you very much. Yes, I
Okay,
can hear you.
go
Good
ahead.
morning. It's really a pleasure to be here with you today. Let me just check if you can see my presentation. Please let me know when that's the case and if it is in presentation mode. You cannot see it? Okay, I'll try to share it again.
Okay, just a minute. Okay.
Can you see it now?
Okay.
Okay, perfect. I hope when I will move from one slide to the other doesn't take that much time. But anyway, thank you so much. My colleagues have greatly introduced the purpose of the project, of the ACT project, and the different work streams. What I'm going to present you today is what we are doing in the legal component of the project, which is one of the components that's focusing on supporting countries, strengthening the regulatory frameworks to better support the implementation of codex standards on AMR. So first of all, yeah, I'm sorry it takes a moment to change
slide. 공유가 안 되는 것. Okay. Okay. Okay.
Yeah. So first of all, how can national legislation, regional legislation support codex standards implementation? I mean, it's very important to understand that legislation is a useful tool for implementing AMR related objectives because it can serve to introduce concrete obligations and responsibilities for governments, for business, and for individuals. But legislation is also important to set up institutions and to crystallize integrated governance and surveillance mechanisms. So for these institutions or for these mechanisms to become compulsory so that the different actors are subject to concrete obligations, it's important that there is a legal framework that gives basis to these mechanisms. It can also serve to regulate the sale and the access to antimicrobials. For only legislation can, for instance, prohibit the over-the-counter sale of antimicrobials. It serves to authorize, restrict, or prohibit the use of selected substances, and also to regulate obligations related to data and information sharing and to data confidentiality, and to introduce requirements for the production and disposal of antimicrobials and antimicrobial waste. So as you see, legislation is a very important step for countries to incorporate the recommendations in codex standards into their national systems, into the national frameworks, and to make them not only compulsory, but also sustainable in time. And in this understanding, the project includes a legal component which basically focuses on two different activities. The first activity is the development of a global tool to monitor implementation of AMR relevant codex standards into regional and national legislation. This tool is not only a legal tool, I'll talk about it a bit more later. It's a comprehensive tool that monitors the implementation of Codex standards. And then we have a second activity where selected countries' regulatory frameworks are analyzed, assessed, and strengthened in line with the Codex Code of Practice. So by supporting the assessment of the national legislation, by using the tool, countries also get recommendations to revise and strengthen their national legislation. And to do all this, we are working with different international consultants, including two legal consultants and a veterinary consultant who is an expert on participatory processes and co-creation processes, plus with national legal consultants in the different countries of the project. So let me now tell you a little bit about the tool. The ACT tool is an assessment tool. It's based on the Codex AMA Code of Practice, and also the guidelines for surveillance. And basically what we have done is to translate Codex recommendations into questions, doing an exercise of prioritization to make it useful and more focused, and trying to identify which of the recommendations in the Codex standards would require either legislation or policy, or national policy, to be properly implemented. So for each of these recommendations that would require legal underpinning, or that would require some national action, there is a question. The 80% of these questions focus on the legislation, with a 20% focusing on surveillance and other technical aspects. And the application of this tool, the tool has been applied, has been deployed already in the 6 countries of the project. And for that, we engaged with a national lawyer, a national legal expert, who helps us collecting the legislation and liaising with the national authorities. And as you can understand, and as AMR being a multifaceted topic, which falls within the remit of different ministries and authorities, this has been a complicated exercise. So these consultants have been not only revising the national legislation, collecting and analyzing the national legislation against the tool, but also meeting all these different ministries, first in bilateral meetings, and then in plenary, all of them together, so that they can all listen to each other and identify where the gaps and where the issues that could deserve, or that could be opportunities for regulatory reform. And the outcome of these exercises is a short report with a snapshot of the national legislation, the identification of the key gaps, and recommendations for legal reform. Just to give you some examples of our preliminary findings. So for instance, in Latin America, in Colombia, we found that there is a legal issue with the sharing of data across different ministries that's hindering the possibility for these ministries to set up an integrated surveillance mechanism together. So because in the legislation, there is no specific requirement for these ministries to share the data, they find they are not entitled to do so. And this is really creating complications at the time to setting up an integrated surveillance mechanism. In Bolivia, one example is that there is no legislation, there's no provision that introduces any sort of restriction for the use of antimicrobials as growth promoters. So this means that in the absence of legislation on this, farmers basically can do whatever they consider appropriate, and it's perfectly fine. Without legislation, there is no mechanism for the government to restrict the use of these substances. In Pakistan, we found a similar situation where there is no specific restriction or prohibition. There is no regulation on the use of antimicrobials as growth promoters. In Nepal, for instance, under the standard for poultry feed, the addition of feed supplements and feed additives in poultry feed is permitted, but the use of antibiotics is strictly prohibited. And we identified a problem with the implementation of the legislation. Also, another example, the Livestock Quality Management Procedure of 2016 restricts the recommendation of antibiotics for use in animal feed, but it allows for the import of specific coccidiostads. And so there are some countries where there is some legal basis, written in the law, but where this is simply not implemented. This is, for instance, the example in Cambodia that you see the diagram. The diagram is divided. I'm not sure you will be able to read the small letter in the circle, but basically these are the different topics that are addressed in the tool. Where the green correspond to those topics where most of the recommendations are incorporated into national legislation, and the reddish oranges are those topics that where there is less incorporation into national legislation. So, for instance, here in Cambodia, we have identified a gap in relation to prescription requirements. There is no provision requirement requiring that only authorized professionals, veterinarians, can prescribe antibiotics and other antimicrobials. And there are no provisions that require veterinary medicinal products and other antimicrobials to be administered by a veterinarian or under the supervision of an authorized professional. So we identified that there is an opportunity to strengthen the legislation and introduce some changes. In Mongolia, you see the situation is a bit different, where and with no provision requiring that only authorized professionals can prescribe antimicrobials of certain types, but also the part on prescription and sale is pretty red, and no provisions regulating the use of antimicrobials for growth promotion. So we also see a potential opportunity in relation to the prudent use. And so this is the work that we have been doing so far. The reports are now being finalized, and they will be shared with the national authorities, trying to identify with them which are their priorities for legal reform. But we have started already thinking of what could be done next, bearing in mind that our tool is divided in the different chapters of the Code of Practice and the guidelines for integrated surveillance that you can see there in your left hand side. And we have identified that some of these topics, particularly everything that deals with institutional coordination, integrated surveillance, but also the access to antimicrobials and the prudent use of antimicrobials, we have identified that in these topics, countries do have significant gaps. I mean, it's not that there are no gaps or opportunities in the other topics, but these are topics where it's the different activities of the project providing good opportunities to move forward with legal reform processes. So what we intend to do next is to discuss with countries which are the policy priorities where they would like to be focusing on to try to trigger these processes that would lead to strengthening the national legislation. At the same time, we realize that enacting legislation is not enough for the legislation to be implemented. And that by, sorry, you can't see that slide. Can you see it now? Yeah. Anyway, you can see the different topics that we're addressing in the tool and how they correspond to some of the focus areas that are being presented to countries. So as I've said, I mean, the development or the revision of legislation is not enough to drive change. So what we are also working on is on methodologies to promote participatory approaches where farmers and different stakeholders are engaged into the processes of legal reform. And we have started doing this as a pilot through what we call a co-creation process. So basically, a co-creation process is slightly different from a traditional participation process in the sense that it doesn't focus on all the different stages of participation. It focuses more specifically in the participation stages that would engage farmers directly in the identification of potential regulatory strategies to develop and to implement the legislation. So very basically, and in a manner that's understandable for everyone, what we do is to try to promote a dialogue between the farmers, the private sector, and the public sector, the regulators. This dialogue can take place for regulatory issues, for legislation that's applied at the federal level or at the central level, but it can also take place for issues, for instance, hygiene improvement or biosecurity in the farm to reduce the need of antimicrobials that are taking place at the local level, at the decentralized level. So by creating these opportunities for dialogue between the private sector and the public sector, we work with countries in tailoring their national legislation to the actual capacities of the country to implement that legislation. What we try to achieve with these processes is to avoid enacting legislation that looks very good in paper, reflects very clearly what's written in the international standard, but it's very far from what can be implemented in the field. But also, so apart from giving us the possibility and the opportunity to developing tailor-made legislation that can be implemented, it also helps us building consensus in the society around which can be the best regulatory solutions to implement the legislation. And these are some examples of a recent pilot of a co-creation process in Cambodia, where we got very powerful feedback from farmers and different private actors on how useful it was for them to start understanding a bit better the reason why some of the restrictions have been incorporated and how to address them and how to find alternatives to the use of antimicrobials. So this is all from my side. It's really a very fast snapshot. I'm available to respond to any query you may have or to give you more information if you are interested.
Thank you, Carmen. Yes, the legislation is quite crucial and important to implementation of code of practice and the guideline of integrated AMR surveillance monitoring program. So it's one quick question, then we can move to the next presentation. Naoko? Okay, you are the one.
Thank you so much, Carmen. It was a great presentation. I really, really appreciated the component that you presented regarding the participation of the community, the stakeholders at the ground level, because it's really, as you pointed out rightly, it's really crucial that not only the legislation is done, but it's enforced and implemented by those people on the ground. So I think it's great that you included that part in your tool. Then my question is, so after this review is complete, under this ACT project, do you have any activity to support the updating or maybe additions of the current legislation? If yes, that's great. If not, I just started to think, because you know this very well, Professor Park also knows very well, but just for the others, we have, WAA has a so-called PVS pathway, Performance of Veterinary Service pathway, and under that, we have a specific targeted support also. So that also, one of the package includes the legislation support specifically. So if this, once the reviews are done and if the countries want request us, I'm sure there will be a great collaboration, opportunity for the collaboration. It's great for the countries to really take up the result of this review, legal review, and put it into the actual legislation, update of the legislation. So I would love to continue discuss about this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. It's not a question, it's a kind of a comment. I believe the OHA can hire you with a better position in the future for your utilization. Okay, thank you very much, Carmen. We